Problem Child by Frank Belknap Long. Dr. Shelton watched two resplendent bluejays hopping about on the fire escape just outside his office window and thought about the Caswells. The harsh gales of autumn had kept the birds from winging their way south, and the migratory plans of the Caswells had been shattered by a wholly human tragedy. But otherwise, the enormously wealthy Caswells, with their jet-set poise and faultless finery, had much in common with his avian visitors. It was surely no crime to be ornamental, and for the barest instant Shelton found himself smiling. Then, abruptly, his ravings took a grimly disturbing tone. Despite his 9 years' experience as a child psychologist, it seemed outrageous to him that he should have allowed 7-year-old, violence-prone Tommy Caswell to upset him so profoundly. Was it because an only child, who had enjoyed every luxury that wealth could provide, had no right to be quite so sullenly defiant and difficult to reason with? Or did his frustration stem simply from the fact that his own deprived, poverty-shadowed childhood had been so different, making him the clumsiest kind of therapist? The second thought, with its subconscious envy implications, gave him no pleasure. But to ignore that possibility seemed so professionally shameful that he might have pursued it further if voices from the outer office hadn't put a quick end to his reverie. Helen Caswell was doing most of the talking. For once, her son was completely silent, probably because the bottled-up hostility inside of him had boiled over, leaving him inarticulate. Shelton could picture it billowing out across the office floor and vanishing in a cloud of vapor before it could take on a meaningful pattern. "I must talk to Dr. Shelton before he sees Tommy," Helen Caswell was saying. "The appointment was for 11, and we're not more than 20 minutes early, unless he has something terribly important to do first." "He's not busy at the moment," Miss Pearson said, with crisp office nurse efficiency. "I'll tell him you're here." As if she hadn't known how often voices carry through a thin glass partition. Shelton wished he'd been given a little more time to assume a professionally detached aspect before he talked to Helen Caswell. In view of what her son had done, maintaining that kind of pretense wasn't easy. The classmate Tommy had fought with and knocked down had been so clearly a bully, the little wretch had deserved a thrashing. If Tommy had merely blackened his eyes only, his parents would have felt aggrieved enough to complain about it, but what put the struggle in a different context was its outcome. There had been dreadful lacerations on the other boy's head and shoulders. His shirt had been ripped to shreds, and a bad skull fracture had sent him to the hospital. Shelton was unaware that he had let his thoughts stray back in time again, however briefly, until he looked up and saw that Nora Pearson had crossed the office to his desk and was reshuffling the mail on the edge of it to gain his attention. "Mrs. Caswell is a little ahead of time for Tommy's appointment," she said with a slight smile, as if amused by her own fear of breasting in on his thoughts. "She seems terribly upset. That's natural enough, I suppose."
"Ordinarily, it would be, in view of Tommy's behavior," Shelton said, "but agitation of any kind is unusual in a Caswell."
"It's funny," Nora Pearson said, "but sometimes I can't help thinking of Tommy as just a badly scared, unhappy little kid."
"I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I can't share your misplaced sympathy for him. In fact—" Shelton stopped without completing the sentence, feeling that a simple shrug would make his disagreement more emphatic.
"It may have something to do with the way you feel about his mother," Nora Pearson said. "You may not realize it, but you hate to judge aloof, highly decorative women too harshly. Admiring them may be a man's privilege, but have you ever stopped to think what having a woman like that for a mother might do to a highly sensitive child in need of warm adult understanding?"
"You're mistaken if you think I haven't given that some thought," Shelton said, relieved that her candor had been too restrained to make him lose his temper. Let's not keep her waiting any longer. She seems almost beside herself with impatience."
Nora Pearson turned without another word and walked out of the office. Her attractiveness, pronounced as it was, could not have successfully competed, even under the most beauty-enhanced subdued lighting, with the breathtaking loveliness of the woman who came into the office following her departure and sat down in the chair by Shelton's desk. It would not have been true to say that Helen Caswell was the most beautiful woman Shelton had ever seen, but in all his 37 years of roving eye experience, her rivals in that respect had been few in number. She was carrying what appeared to be a drawing or a photograph, since it was tied up between boards with a loosely knotted ribbon. She met his gaze directly, as she'd done on their previous meetings, and said without preamble, "I found this drawing in Tommy's playroom this morning. He made it after something dreadful happened that has affected him in a very strange way. It may have alarmed me more than it should have." She had started to untie the package, but Shelton stopped her with a reproving frown and an abrupt wave of his hand. "You'd better tell me what happened first," he said. "We'll be on firmer ground if we discuss it from the start." Yes, of course," Tommy's mother said. "Forgive me for not realizing that. Our dog, we have only one, as I think you know, was run over yesterday right in front of the main gate. The gardener was on the opposite side of the house, and so didn't actually see the car. But a moment before he got there, Rover was still barking fiercely, and when he looked out, there was a swirl of dust at a turn in the road."
"And the dog lying dead?"
Tommy's mother nodded. "Yes, horribly torn, mangled, dust, as Tommy depicted it. But that's only a part of what he's drawn. Here, you'll understand better when you've looked at this."
She had moved closer to Shelton, and her hand was slightly tremulous when she laid the drawing on the desk directly in front of him. For a brief instant, her sudden nearness drove every other thought from his mind. Even the drawing seemed to dwindle in importance, so that he did not so much as lower his eyes. In the minds of most men, there is no sharply dividing line between a strikingly beautiful and a physically desirable woman, and Shelton was the exact opposite of an exception to the rule in that respect. But there was something about Tommy's mother that seemed to strip all rules of their gradations and make them meaningless. He only knew that with the awareness of her nearness there had come a single abject preoccupation which was a throwback to his early adolescence, and so seemed to make a mockery of his adult professionalism. The realization, it was fortunately quick in coming, that it was his professionalism alone that had given Tommy's mother confidence in him as a wise healer, alerted him to the danger of jeopardizing it. He forced himself to think solely of Tommy again as he stared down at the drawing, tilting it slightly as he studied it. It was the opposite of stick-figurish, and for a boy of 7, truly masterful to such an extent that the slight traces of crudity here and there could have been the result of haste alone. Tommy had depicted the nearly decapitated dog as he stretched out at full length, surrounded by an uneven dark stain. He had used colored crayons, blue, brown, yellow, and red. The red he had used sparingly, but just beneath the slain animal's torn-out throat, it was not so much a mere stain as a pooling. There were 2 animal figures, but the larger one was half in shadow, with the gate of the estate towering over it. It could have been just emerging from the shadows, but somehow it had more the appearance of retreating after having attacked the dog savagely. A child's fantasizing could take many forms, but never in his own childhood had Shelton ever pictured to himself a creature so repellent.
It was both fanged and taloned, and if it had been just a little less mammal-like in its overall aspect, it could easily have been thought of as reptilian, a large black bear with scales replacing much of its fur, and with the suggested fork-tongued venomness of a poisonous lizard, a Gia monster perhaps. It was the contradictory image that had seemingly been present in Tommy's mind when he'd set to work with the crayons. In picture books, and on one of 2 or 3 parent-accompanied visits to the zoo, Tommy had probably seen lizards pointed out to him as poisonous, but what could have prompted him to combine a bear and a lizard in so hideous a way, or could even have enabled him to depict it so realistically? It was a question that called out for an answer, and Tommy's mother supplied one. "That's Tommy's Gruth," she said.
"His what?"
"Oh, I was sure he'd told you something about his drawings," Helen Caswell said. "He gives each animal a name, but Gruth he talks about the most. And yesterday, before Rover was killed, and I found this one, he said a strange thing. If Rover gets hurt, it won't be my fault. Gruth doesn't like such a mean dog barking at him all the time."
What distressed Shelton the most was the simple fact that he hadn't gotten as much out of Tommy as his mother had assumed. In a child with such exceptional artistic gifts, defiance, no matter how stubborn, should have been accompanied by at least a slight desire to boast. He was on the verge of explaining that he'd been kept completely in the dark about the drawings when he thought better of it, deciding that a therapy session which postponed certain probing questions until the next time was hardly to his credit. Shelton had always believed there was a wider range of gradations between the strict truth and out-and-out falsehood than most people realized. To reassure Helen Caswell about the drawing without letting her suspect that his concern ran deeper might prove, he realized, as difficult as striking just the right note on a musical scale. If you struck the wrong note, you sowed mistrust, no matter how hard you tried to correct the blunder afterwards. Startled a bit by his own daring, he reached out and pressed her hand. With any other woman, he would not have felt the gesture went beyond warm professional reassurance. But with Helen Caswell, her skin was even softer than he'd imagined it to be, and she seemed to return, however slightly, the firm pressure of his fingers. It was more than he had counted on, and he had to fight against an impulse to go perhaps dangerously far too fast. "This drawing is helpful, of course," he said at last. "It sheds a further light on Tommy's almost desperate need for security and protection. An oversensitive child, and he is that, has many imagined enemies, and it's not unusual for such a child to create a very formidable imaginary companion." Shelton paused an instant, then went on quickly, fearing that he might make the mistake of pressing Helen Caswell's hand too firmly and cause its instant withdrawal. "Imaginary companions, as I'm sure you know, are extremely common in childhood, right up to the age of 8. It can take the form of a non-existent human playmate, boy or girl, but it can just as readily be an animal." "But so ferocious a creature!" Helen Caswell exclaimed. "How could Tommy think of it as protective?" "You're forgetting its imaginary character," Shelton said. "Don't you see, a boy like Tommy would be quite capable of imagining a monster as dangerous as a venomous snake that would purr like a kitten whenever he patted it. It wouldn't have to be unfriendly to him. In fact—" The scream arose with appalling suddenness, blotting from Shelton's mind everything that he had been saying. It was a terrified woman's scream, with overtones of outrage, or, at the very least, a kind of fiercely protesting anger. It was followed by a shouted curse in a male voice, and the sounds of a struggle. It was unmistakably from the outer office, and a second scream was cut off as abruptly as it had arisen. Helen Caswell leapt to her feet, but Shelton waved her back with a plea he was almost sure she would ignore. "Please," he urged, "just remain here for a moment. I'll take care of whatever it is."
He crossed to the door in 6 long strides, and was through it, and staring at Nora Pearson, lying sprawled out on the floor so swiftly that her second abruptly terminated scream still seemed to be echoing in his ears. Her hair was disheveled, her uniform ripped at one shoulder, and there was a dark, swelling bruise on her right temple. One of her shoes had fallen off. Although there was still a slightly dazed look in her eyes, she lost no time in struggling to rise. She got to her knees first, and then to her feet, shaking her head as Shelton started forward to help her. "I'm all right," she breathed, swaying a little and gripping an edge of the reception desk for support. Shelton was swaying a little too, so great was the added shock of noticing that the large black leather sofa opposite the desk had been pushed back too close to the wall to provide concealment for the smallest of human figures, frightened or otherwise. "Where's Tommy?" was all he could manage. "Tell me!"
"2 masked men came in and grabbed hold of him. They both had guns and could have shot me. I must have been mad to struggle with them."
It made a terrible kind of sense, and just from the look in her eyes, Shelton knew she shared the thoughts that started racing through his mind. The penalty of enormous wealth, a ransom attempt by skilled professionals, easier here than at a heavily guarded estate. With advanced planning, a careful check on the exact hours of Tommy's daily visits. "If they've carried him down in the elevator and out across the lobby, they must have shot Henley or used a blackjack," he heard himself saying. "Did you hear a shot? Wait, Henley may have been upstairs in the other elevator." Nora Pearson shook her head.
No, they didn't come and go through the lobby. When Tommy started kicking out at them, they became so enraged they forgot I was listening. They broke the padlock on the Elm Street entrance and came right up. They've a car waiting."
Shelton didn't wait to hear more. He was out of the office and running toward the double flight of descending stairs on the Elm Street side of the apartment building before he realized that Helen Caswell hadn't even cried out at what she must have seen and heard if she had followed him into the outer office. He was sure that she ignored his plea to remain by his desk, but it seemed unlikely that no sound could have come from beyond the left open door unless she had crumpled to the floor in a dead faint. For the barest instant, his failure to display concern troubled him and almost caused him to go back, for fear that she would think him callous. But he put the thought from him as he started down the stairs, knowing that if he somehow managed to get Tommy back, her gratefulness would find expression in something more than just a tightening of her slim, exquisitely manicured fingers. Cool and poised and self-contained, as he knew her to be, the proud Caswell standoffishness might well surprise him by dissolving for him alone in a very special way. Elm Street was usually traffic congested, and there was a slim possibility that the getaway car was still in sight. But even if it wasn't, there remained a chance that he could overtake it in a speeding taxi and create some kind of disturbance that would bring the police running. The thought that he might be placing his life on the line if the car collided with the taxi and sped on, exposing him to a burst of gunfire from a lowered window, was not absent from his mind. But there were risks so worth taking for the sake of exceptional rewards that his own decisiveness surprised him, for he was the opposite of reckless. When he reached the base of the stairs and passed out into the street, the brightness of the sunlight dazzled him for a moment and prevented him from determining as quickly as he could have wished how heavy the traffic was both up and down its long length. It did not seem to be heavy at all, as he quickly enough discovered when his gaze adjusted to the glare. But such occasional lulls were not in the least surprising, and the only thing that startled him was something quite different. On the far side of the street, no more than a block and a half ahead of where he was standing, a blue limousine was zigzagging back and forth as if it were totally out of control. It went traveling along in the same erratic way for another half-block, and then abruptly leapt the curb and crashed against the facade of a 10-story apartment building. The crash was half-deafening, even at so great a distance, but Shelton did not even wait for his ears to stop ringing before running out into the middle of the street and heading for the spiral of smoke that was rising from what almost had to be a smoldering mass of wreckage. It was one of Shelton's few guiding principles that reality could not be evaded in any way that made enduring sense, and he had steeled himself to accept whatever he might see. But the ghastliness of what had taken place inside the car as a result of the crash surpassed in horror most of the battlefront close-ups that children, perhaps unwisely, are seldom permitted to see when they are flashed at the late hour on the TV screen. There was no need for him to remind himself that violent collisions could inflict hideous injuries on the occupants of a car, and the crushed skull of the man in the driver's seat and the severed arm of the other might have made him feel that the crash had been no more than slightly exceptional in that respect, if both of the dead men had not been so mutilated in a half-dozen other ways. It seemed almost as if a buzzsaw had passed back and forth through the car, from window to window, again and again, leaving a crimson trail in its wake, and vanishing at last with a moist eyeball and half a human scalp adhering to it tenaciously. There was a sudden stir of movement in the murky depths of the car, but for a full minute Shelton remained staring, too appalled and shaken to think clearly, and hardly daring to hope that it could be Tommy. There are several ways of emerging from a doubled-up position in an oppressively narrow space, and Tommy accomplished it by unfolding himself in slow, careful stages. First, the upper part of his body came into view, assisted by elbow thrusts to right and left. Then his legs emerged from the murk in just as vigorous motion, making it very clear that he hadn't suffered a broken spine or some other horribly crippling injury. "Stay right where you are, Tommy," he said. "I'm going to lift you out." It was easier to accomplish swiftly than he had feared it might be. He simply reached deeply into the car, gripped Tommy firmly by the shoulders, and, shifting his own weight a little, carried him over the legs of the corpse in the driver's seat and out into the street. He lowered him to the pavement, cautioning him not to move, and stared about him. At least 20 people were crowding the pavement now, and the apartment building doorman was blowing his whistle and doing his best to keep them from making it impossible for him to get back into the building and telephone for the police and an ambulance if no one else did. Between the whistle blasts, his voice rose in a desperate plea. "Stay back! Watch it! The car could explode!" The instant he saw Tommy, he gripped Shelton's arm. "So that kid stayed alive! I wouldn't have believed it! How many in the car?" "2," Shelton said. "Both dead. Listen to me. The police will be here any minute now. I'm sure of it." He took out his card and handed it to the man. "I'm a doctor, as you can see. My office is just 3 blocks away. I'm taking the boy there. When the police get here, just show them this card." "I don't know, Doctor. It could cause me trouble. You'll be leaving the scene of an accident with one of the—" He shrugged and dropped his protest when he saw the look in Shelton's eyes. Lifting Tommy to his shoulders and pushing his way through the crowd, Shelton cursed the man in no uncertain terms. An unauthorized display of authority had always enraged him, but never more than now. It indicated something else as well. He would have to guard against letting his nerves be rubbed any rawer. Tommy hadn't said a word, and that, too, was more than a little unnerving. It brought back everything he had endured through the boys' stubborn refusal to respond with more than a few sullen words in all of their talks. The fault was perhaps his now, for he had failed to ask Tommy if he was in pain or display the slightest evidence of concern. For some reason, he found it difficult to get that close to his youngest patient, even now. There was an anger, a resentment, still smoldering in him that would not permit him to overcome the way he felt about what Tommy had done at school or the pain he had brought upon his mother. Shelton had been moving as swiftly as an unburdened jogger, striving to improve his track record at the break of dawn, but he stopped abruptly to question Tommy, more to dispel the uneasiness the boy's silence had caused than because he'd experienced any twinge of conscience.
"Have you any pain, Tommy, in your back or your legs? Does it hurt you to take a long, deep breath?"
Silence. Not a word in reply. Even when he added,
"Sometimes you can be hurt and not know it right away. I just wanted to be sure that you're all right."
It was wrong, he felt, to expect anything of a child as badly shaken up as Tommy must have been, and he managed to keep his anger under control until he reached the Elm Street entrance and had started up the stairs. It was only then that Tommy spoke for the first time.
"Daddy loves me. My mother doesn't care how much she hurts him."
Daddy loves me. My mother doesn't care how much she hurts him. The two brief sentences, with their slightly disconnected aspect and a strange reversal of the usual Freudian norm, still seemed to echo and re-echo in Shelton's mind 3 hours later, as he sat alone in his office, tapping his desk with his forefinger to relieve a tension that refused to go away. The police had come and gone without causing the Bluejays to take flight, and that had been just as true following the departure in sequence of Nora Pearson, looking hurt and angry, and casting on him an almost pitying glance, and finally of Helen Caswell herself with Tommy at her side. Now even the Bluejays were gone, and the cold winds of autumn were causing the fire escape to rattle in a peculiarly dismal way. He did not feel dismal, however, just tense. How could he feel dismal when, with Tommy in the outer office and the door closed, Helen Caswell had come quickly and eagerly into his arms, and he had kissed her hair and lips and eyes, and held her in so long and lingering an embrace that the intermingling that takes place in a certain famous statue became more than duplicated, but with the opposite of a marble coldness. How long, he wondered, would it take her to phone? He had an obsessive need to hear her voice again just once before the night closed in, and she had promised that she would not disappoint him.
"Darling, darling, I'm home now, and everything is fine, and tomorrow is another day."
The call would come. He was sure of that, but would it not please her more if he did the phoning? Why must he force himself to wait? The car could hardly have failed to reach the estate by now. She might well be mounting the stairs to get the phone at that very moment. It was not, she had told him, in the bedroom, but if her husband answered, he could hang up. He reached out, drew the desk phone nearer, and was just about to uncradle it when he heard the crackling. He thought at first it was coming from the fire escape, until a small fragment of plaster fell from the wall at right angles to his desk and made him look in that direction. A 4 or 5 foot square section of the wall seemed to be on fire. It was crackling more and more loudly as it buckled and swayed, and the smoke that poured from it half concealed the dark animal shape that was crouching at its base. For a moment he saw little more than its arched backhand-long snout and the glitter of its claws as its sloth-like movements dragged them back and forth across the floor. Then, abruptly, it reared up and began to move in so agile a way that it was almost upon its appointed victim before a still-glowing, impossible-to-explain after-image of itself seemed to vanish from its wake. In that monstrous prolongation of itself, it took on an almost serial aspect, as if it had split up into 10 or 12 beasts trailing one another in totally malignant sequence, the first one with its claws the widest spread. As Shelton leapt to his feet and went staggering back against the desk, sending his chair clattering, he threw his arms across his face in what is perhaps the most natural of all human gestures in the presence of an eye-gouging threat. For a terrible instant, something seemed to scream in the room as if there are acts of flesh-tearing violence so shattering that even the inanimate can cry out in protest. Just as the attacking beast withdrew, swirling back toward the wall from which it had emerged, the desk phone began to ring. It rang 20 times and stopped. After that there was silence in the office, broken only by the occasional creaking of the fire escape in the harsh November wind, and a slow but steady drip, drip, drip from the desktop.